On your mark.
On your mark.
Get set.
Get set.
Now ready.
Ready, go.
Provocative, engaging, and usually quite a lady.
Okay, they're asking for it.
Deborah, go.
So this week, the Supreme Court handed down its decisions in a couple of cases, both brought by the same organization, Students for Fair Admissions. They were challenging the race-based preferences that are factored in when students apply for admission to Harvard University and also the University of North Carolina. And clearly, in both those cases, the court says, that's it. It's time to put an end to this. I was looking at a poll from Pew Research Center, and this was from 2019, and their poll showed that 73% of Americans said no. We don't need to use race-based preferences in higher education. There was an ABC poll. Now, granted, this is just a few short years later, and their poll showed that 82% of Americans said, let's end it now. Time to put that away. Even when you break down the numbers by racial groups, the Pew poll had, I thought it was pretty interesting, 60+% of Blacks saying, hey, we don't need this. Let's put an end to it. When you look at the ABC poll from June of this year, their numbers show that only 25% of Blacks say it's time to end it. 60% of whites, 40% of Hispanics, and 58% of Asian Americans say it's time to end it. There is no question about it. This is a very, very controversial issue. I'm not going to spend a long time talking about the history of it. We know the history of our nation when it comes to the issue of slavery, when it comes to the issue of Jim Crow, when it comes to the issue of discrimination. We all know about that. We hear about it a lot. For all of this discussion about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, we hear it all the time. Since the Supreme Court's ruling, we have also heard many leaders issuing dire warnings that the future for America is going to be on shaky ground because of affirmative action coming to an end.
NAACP President Derek Johnson.
But the Supreme Court has failed America. It is unfortunate that we are not embracing diversity and opening up opportunities. For the centuries of harm directed, state-sponsored against African Americans, a few decades of a program that was not perfect should not be eliminated. The worst thing about affirmative action is that it created Clarence Thomas. So this is a sad day for the future of this nation, and corporations, institutions of higher learners must do all that they can to ensure diversity in their spaces.
Okay, that was about as insightful as I expected. We've seen the President Biden, striking out and saying that the Supreme Court is radical. They're radical because of this decision. Let me tell you the way I look at affirmative action. I look at affirmative action as something that really should have been very short term. And it should have been short term immediately after Brown versus the Board of Education. I think that would have been the time to push more Blacks to help get their foot in the door of more selective colleges and universities. I've had an experience, and let me just share my personal experience. From the time I was in probably fourth grade through sixth grade, I was in a program, they called it the gifted program, the accelerated program. And then in sixth grade, there was a special program for the accelerated students, and it was put together by the University of Chicago. And what the idea was, let us take a group of students, a single classroom of students from an urban school, working class school, some even poor, but primarily working class. Let's see what happens if we put them in a suburban school, more affluent school for the year. We want to know, can high-achieving students from this background really compete and remain high-achieving students when placed in a more affluent environment? So for the year, we were bust. And it was a really interesting experience. It's one I'll never forget. We did fine. But why was that? Why did we do fine? Here we are, students from working class, urban community, all Black. How did we get out to a very actually nice suburb and do well? I can tell you why. A couple of reasons. One reason was we didn't get a lot of excuses tossed our way. We couldn't use excuses. We just couldn't use excuses as to why we can't do this, and we're from this community, and our ancestors were slaves. We just can't. Also, on my entire block, there were only 2 families who didn't have a mom and a dad. As they say, real talk, only 2 families. The one mom, she worked 3 jobs, and that always blew me away. I never understood that. How does anyone work 3 jobs to raise her daughter and her son? And the other mom, she worked a job, but she wasn't working 3 jobs, but her daughter did okay. The mom with the 3 jobs, her daughter went on to, she's a gynecologist, University of Chicago graduate, medical school. The point that I'm making, we just didn't have this environment that says, well, you have to understand because of your skin color, you're just not going to be able to do well. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that there were other students, maybe not necessarily in that program, but this was only one class, but other students in the school, people who went ahead and grew up and became just good, solid citizens. So that at its core is the reason why I really don't favor affirmative action. That's part one. The other part of that is the teachers, they really were committed to educating us. They were committed to our learning how to read, how to do math, and just garner an interest in the world. Then on to another school in 7th and 8th grade, because we moved. And I couldn't believe it, but there was also an accelerated program there. Actually, 2 classes of the accelerateds there. The whole focus was work hard. Now, for some students who went to, I don't know, maybe a better school or a suburban school in a good suburb, that's not a big deal. It was nothing new. But I also knew that there were kids who were in classrooms that they really weren't challenged. They really weren't asked to go above and beyond because nobody thought that they could, because of their environment, because of who their parents are or were. They just couldn't do it. But our classrooms, we were actually isolated from the rest of the school. And I'm not bragging about that. There's nothing to brag about. It's kind of sad, but they kept us isolated. There was not one student that scored less than a 10th grade level. But other students in those 2 classes, 11th grade, 12th grade, and they all wound up going to the 2 top public high schools in Chicago. Not all of them, but a whole lot of them, if they didn't go on to private schools. And a lot of them did that as well. The point that I am making here is that the expectations for us was so high, and we were so motivated and so encouraged to meet the challenge that we had a better chance of succeeding than kids who were in environments. And this, by the way, is not exclusive to working class and poor Black students, but that's across the board. But we had a better shot because we weren't weighed down with all of these narratives. And this is really, it's just exploded today. We weren't weighed down with that. All right, the next 4 years aren't so good. So when my parents moved and purchased their home in a decent neighborhood, and we went to a decent high school in Chicago, my first 2 years, I was a goof. I was a huge goof. And you know why? Because I found my best friend there the first week of school. And actually, she was a goof too. We would cut class. We would go to the movies. She would steal her mom's car when her mom was sleeping before she got up for work, or her father's car. We were just goofs, just having fun. That's all. And you may say, well, didn't your parents stop you? Well, this is how it worked. My best friend, her sister, worked in the principal's office. And letters that would come, and they used to send letters a lot, she would just take the letter and put it in her pocket. So no. But then the other thing I should add, every summer during that time, you could go to summer school. And you didn't have to go to summer school just because you were failing. Some kids went to summer school just because mom, dad said you're going to summer school, or they wanted to go to summer school. I went to summer school because I had failed maybe 2 classes, maybe 3 classes, just because I was just a goof. But it was during my sophomore year, one particular time, my father actually got the call. And when he came up to the school, it was probably, out of my entire 4 years, the most embarrassing day of my life. Not because he was up there acting crazy or anything like that, but he was very clear and he was very direct, and he spoke with my teacher, and I still see that smirk on her face. I can't remember her name, but she was looking like, all those times I would tell you to be quiet, do your work, and you would just look at me and ignore me. Now, let's see how you act now. It was humiliating, but I actually did turn around, and I even encouraged my best friend to turn around. I used the next 2 years to buckle down. I'm serious. I buckled down hard. I did my work. And you may be thinking, that one simple thing made you turn around, your father coming up to the school, talking to the teacher? Yeah, for 2 reasons. One, I was exposed as basically being a goof when I really was far better than a goof, but I wasn't applying myself. And then at that halfway point in high school comes the reality, hey, I know I'm going to college, but I haven't prepared myself to go to college. So I spent those next 2 years working really, really hard. Now, there's a couple of things here. One, it was during that time that the Chicago Board of Education was making some pretty interesting moves. And in our school, they took what I don't think anybody would argue, our top teachers, our best teachers, the biology teacher, Mrs. Hare, excellent, and others. And they took them out of our school and they put them in another school on the southwest side, which at that time was a white school. And they replaced them with teachers I don't even know what they were about, but they sure as heck weren't as good. So that was thing number 1. But number 2, just overall, and I didn't know it at the time, the standards were actually fairly low. We all just assumed we went to a pretty decent school. But the standards were actually, generally speaking, they weren't as good. Not as good as schools in other communities, non-Black communities, because for a Black community, those standards were pretty darn good. So here's the point. Senior year, early part, well, some people started in junior, but I senior, you start applying to colleges. And I had a college that I really wanted to go to, and I applied, and I was rejected. Well, I found out they had a special program, and this special program was actually geared towards minority students. And I applied for it, and I wasn't accepted. I kid you not, I wasn't accepted. Why? Because I couldn't even meet that bar. So I went and I was talking to my counselor, and I told him, I said, Mr. Reamer, and I was about to cry too. I said, I have to go away to school. I have to. And I was thinking in the back of my mind that my parents would be so disappointed. My younger siblings would probably wonder, what happened? I couldn't disappoint myself. And he said, I'm sorry. Your SAT scores or ACT, whatever it was then, your grades for the last 2 years, this year and last year, are really good. But they do an average. And the first year you were doing a 1 point something, you went to summer school. Your second year you did a 1 point whatever, you went to summer school to bring it up to 2 point. But when you average all together, it's not that good. And my eyes were brimming And then he turned around in his seat and he opened up his file cabinet. And he said, but I have something that really might be just right for you. And I said, well, what is it? He said, there's a private junior college downstate. I think this is what you need. I was so grateful that this is the way I was thinking, just to be able to go away. All right. So I put everything together and sent off and all of that kind of stuff. And I got accepted. And I was so excited. And when I got down there, I just smiled. I was like, I'm here. I made it. Well, the real significance of my being there was that this school, this 2-year college, this rather expensive private 2-year college, they gave me my academic muscle. This is where everything changed for me. Everything changed for me. And I had no idea how far behind I was. Even my last 2 years of high school, when I was getting A's, I thought it was because I was just so incredibly smart, but I hadn't applied myself. I'm okay smart, but the real issue was the bar wasn't as high as it really should have been. After I graduated, obviously before I graduated, I decided to start applying for schools. Now, the one school I really did want to go to was out of state, and my mom was like, no, you're not going out of state. So I went to the school that I initially applied to and tried to come through their, which I can only call Affirmative Action program, and was denied that. So I get to the school and I am competing. I am not failing out. I am doing well there. And I didn't come through their Affirmative Action program. It was only because of those solid, very solid 2 years of getting my foundation straight, building my academic muscle. That's the only reason I was able to do well. I'll tell you a real quick funny incident though. One evening, I was in my econ class, and the class was about to start. Students were there early. I don't know if it was going to be a test or what, but people had come early. Most of the students were there. And the Black students had congregated kind of like in a corner, maybe, 6 or 7 of us. And then the rest were white students. And everybody was just kind of talking. The professor just suddenly said he was ready to start class. Okay, that's fine. And there was still some, lingering conversations. But he turned around and he just shouted out in the classroom, hey, and I'm not going to say the name of the program because I know a lot of people did go through that program, but you people in that program, be quiet. And it just cut me so badly because I'm thinking, first of all, why did you have to address the group as, hey, you affirmative action? I'm just going to use that because essentially that's what it was. Hey, you affirmative action students, be quiet. And I turned around and I said, first of all, I'm not in the affirmative action program, so I don't know who you're talking to. And he looked at me and some students were looking and he just turned around. He said, well, guys, we're starting class. And I never forgot that. I just never forgot that. It was the assumption that because I was Black, that I had to be there because of affirmative action. I just had to. And it just wasn't the case. One other quick incident happened in my last year of school at another school. And it was almost the same exact thing. This ridiculously disgusting professor. After the class, he just kind of got quiet and I heard him say to the white students, hey, just sit here for a minute. Sit here. He said, okay, you guys, you all can go. Now, he didn't say you affirmative action students or anything like that, but he clearly was dismissive. So we all kind of looked and I kind of put my hand up. I was like, wait, he told them to stay. We kind of didn't leave, but just kind of stood by the door and he just started talking. He was like, I'm offering this special advanced course over the summer and I'd love if you guys would sign up. Once again, he assumed that we probably couldn't be in that advanced course. Well, the way he was, his personality, you just wouldn't want to do it anyways. My point is the assumptions were made. My other point is I didn't need affirmative action. Now, had I not gone away to that junior college, I would have needed affirmative action. And thank God it worked the way it worked. Actually, I think that most students, if given a choice, being able to take these standardized tests well, being able to write well, being able to read well, being able to analyze, versus being given a few black points to get into college. I believe most students would rather be able to just do it themselves, compete, and enter on their own merit. It just feels better, and it knocks all of these stupid perceptions, blows them out the water. So am I saying that black students can't do math well, they can't read well, aren't up to par when it comes to standardized tests? No, I'm actually not saying that. It's quite the contrary, especially when you talk about the black students that apply to schools like Harvard, to the Ivy League schools. There is data that shows those students are actually your high-achieving students. These are smart kids. Problem is, if they have not attended an elite school, K through 6, and indeed 6 through 12th grade, they're going to have a bit of a problem. Those black students that have attended such elite schools, they actually do very well. They test in like any other applicant. So there is still an issue since most students, black or white, don't attend elite private schools in elementary and high school. And that's what we need to really look at here. Now, you know how I feel about sharing a lot of data in a podcast, but I'm going to share something from the University of Texas, which released data that was in connection with this lawsuit concerning affirmative action. It was the Fisher case. Abigail Fisher denied a position, and she had some pretty darn good academic credentials, but the school made a decision to bring in a minority with lesser credentials. But here's the data that they showed. This was for the entering class of 2009. The racial breakdown, on average, here's what they had. Asians that applied, on average, had SAT scores of 1,991 and a grade point average of 3.07. Whites had SAT scores on average 1914 and a GPA of 3.4. Hispanics, SATs on average 1794 and a GPA of 2.83. And blacks on average had SAT scores of 1524 and a GPA of 2.57. They found that Asians were in the 93rd percentile when it came to SAT scores, and blacks in the 52nd percentile. So is there any wonder that not just with Fisher in Texas, or was that girl up in Michigan, Grutter, the same thing happened? They were like, wait a minute. I mean, I may not rank at the number one applicant, but I'm doing better than these minority students. Why am I being pushed aside? And you're allowing them to come in. And that's been at the crux of the pushback from people who are saying that's discrimination. And it is. Of course, proponents would say, well, we have to understand the historical impact that, our history has had. So these minority students, and they need a leg up. There was a piece written, and this is some time ago, but by William Bowen and Derek Bach. And both of these guys they're academics. I think Bach was once the president of Harvard. He's a lawyer. But their research, they found that the average Black first-year law student attending a highly selective school like a Harvard and is a beneficiary of affirmative action has a GPA in the bottom 10% of his or her class. That's the average one. Also, they found that when it comes to grad school, the beneficiaries of affirmative action actually do better with their grades than those in undergrad. And they say that may be due in part because they tend to shy away from subjects like science and engineering. Why? Because they grade on a tougher curve. So they move into some of the softer courses. And it kind of makes sense. Pretty much the grade point average that a student earns, and this is across the board, in high school, that cumulative grade point average that's pretty much going to be their grade point average in college. So if you have a student who comes out with a 3.0 in high school, pretty much they're going to be a 3.0, 3.1 student when they graduate college. If you have a student that's a 2.1, pretty much they're going to be a 2.1, 2.2 student. William Bowen and Derek Bach, the two that I got the data from, that's not actually new information. You know who else had been saying this for years? And my dear friend Wendy and I, we would talk about this a lot. But Dr. Walter Williams, who's now deceased, he was an economist, a very, very brilliant man. And also Thomas Sowell, also an economist. They both have talked about when Blacks enter Ivy League schools. I remember Walter Williams saying that by the second year, many of them have left the school, sometimes because they just can't take the pressure anymore. Why can't I get into this higher GPA? Why can't I do better on this test or that test? Why? I was so good. I was a top student in my high school. Why can't I? I was good enough to get into this university. But what Doctors Williams and Sowell have both said is that they really weren't properly prepared to compete at that level. And for whatever reason, people who think that we're just helping, we're giving them a leg up. You're not really helping. Some of the research also showed that Blacks, and this is really by contrast, Blacks that went to other schools, not the Ivy League schools, which, by the way, everybody can relax. Most of us don't go to those schools, but the Blacks that chose to go to maybe second-tier schools or maybe even state universities, other private colleges, when they are top students when they leave their high school, they do very, very well. Even those who have been given this racial advantage, which they don't need, but they do very, very well. And I was reading that in part is because their confidence has not been hurt by being in a field in a school that they really shouldn't have been allowed in because they were behind the other students, but were given an advantage based on their race. And then they wind up, I can't do this. I'm not going to be an engineer. I'm not going to be able to go to medical school here. I'm not going to be able to do law. So they changed their majors and they said, well, I'll do theater. I'll do sociology. I'll do journalism. Not to put any of those majors down, but it's kind of sad that a kid that was so optimistic and looked at their future as I'm going to do exceedingly well in law or whatever, because I'm going to go to Harvard, only to find that when they get there, they're in the lower 25% of the class. And that was due because they were let in when they really shouldn't have been competing there. But when they go to a less competitive school, not that these schools are bad schools, don't get me wrong, they are really good students and they actually do well. One of the most glaring examples of the point that I'm really trying to make, it happened a few years ago. There was a young woman, she attended Westinghouse High School, located on Chicago's West Side in an impoverished community. This young lady was number one in her school. However, she had great difficulty being accepted at the schools of her choice. I recall then Governor Jeb Bush down in Florida, he offered to give her a scholarship to come down to his state and to go to college. And I remember there were lots of discussions about the system and the racism and blah, blah, blah. And much like today in this discussion about affirmative action, since affirmative action has been canceled, that it's going to hurt so many students, people really are missing the point. The other impact that affirmative action has had, and it's not on the students, it's on the society. This is what happens. And you probably have heard this too. Over the years, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard some white guy tell me how he was denied a job because the company had to hire a minority. And I remember saying, well, who told you this? Well, the secretary. She pulled me aside and said how sorry she was that I couldn't get the job, but they had to hire an African American. And I remember saying, probably each and every time, well, that secretary should have lost her job. That's confidential information. The thing is, I didn't really believe that, but that's the idea that so many people have about affirmative action. And I know that's not in higher education, but people do believe that you really aren't qualified, but they just gave it to you because you're Black. And I even know Blacks who feel that Blacks who are affirmative action beneficiaries, they really aren't qualified. That's really, that's a toughie because technically correct. But the travesty of affirmative action, and I'm talking specifically in highly selective schools, the real travesty is that these are your high achieving students. There is little doubt that they would be able to keep up with the rigors of the curricula at those schools. But unless they've attended an elite grammar school and an elite high school, or gotten a similar quality education, maybe from a great charter school, even from homeschooling, they will not have a strong enough foundation to be admitted into those schools without benefit of the Black points. And that really is the shame of it all. Let's get over to the Congressional Black Caucus and hear what its chair had to say.
We're joined by Democratic Representative Stephen Horsford of Nevada. He is the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Well, first, let me say I truly condemn the decision by the majority conservative members of the U.S. Supreme Court. They have rolled back 45 years of precedent in taking race-conscious preference into consideration as one of many factors in accepting a student for admission. I support the dissent by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sonia Sotomayor. I believe that we have to win in these upcoming elections to make their minority dissent the majority opinion in the future. We need to look at reforms to the Supreme Court because the legitimacy of this court has been called into question. The very fact that several of the justices were appointed, despite the fact that President Obama was not offered his nominee, Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump did everything they could to stack this court. And since that time, they have rolled back rights, now on affirmative action, previously for women, and we're continuing to be concerned about voting rights and student loan forgiveness as well. But this decision, make no mistake about it, is going to make it harder for Black students and students of color to be considered for admission in public and private institutions.
And that too was from CBS. And that poor audio quality was also from CBS. I think he was recording from some sort of small room. All right, so we heard from two prominent leaders, the NAACP head and also the head of the Congressional Black Caucus. And of course, the NAACP guy, he had to toss in his disdain for Justice Thomas. And then the guy from the Congressional Black Caucus, he threw everything but the kitchen sink in there. He got abortion in, he got student loans, he got a couple other things in there.
Well, that's no surprise at all.
What's interesting is that neither of those two, or white liberals, or any of the groups that they represent, actually believe that these Black students can do any better unless they do have a racial hand up. This is why they're wringing their hands and going crazy. That's part one. But the other part of it is they know what's at the root of the problem. They know it, and they refuse to address it. So what exactly is it? Why is it that some of the best and brightest Black students in the country, why is it that they can't pass or they can't do as well. That's a better way to put it. They can't do as well to get into these schools on their own merit. The schools, they use a number of factors in considering who will be allowed into the school and who won't. It's not just these SATs or ACTs, but they also take into account grades, grade point averages, communities, families. What else do they do? Extracurricular activities and things of that nature. So the universities, they say that we are looking at all of this information on the application for an individual. We want to look at the individual. Yet, a Black student. Hey, throw some Black points on top of that one. We really are talking about, when we talk about these highly selective schools, when we talk about Ivy League schools, when we talk about these second-tier schools, we are not talking about places where most students go for college. We're not talking about that. So in one sense, it's nothing that affects most people. Now, you could say that, other schools use affirmative action. That's true. But you'd be surprised, and I was reading this as well. A total of 19 states don't have any, or certainly didn't have any affirmative action in higher education before the Supreme Court's decision. So that's actually 11 more states than the ones that used a legislative ban. So 11 just on their own said no, that the Ballotopia data, they say at the footnote, that the totals may not be complete, that there was data not provided by all 650 public colleges. So it could be more, but there could also be just a few more. The source, by the way, for that data was College Board and College Data. So they keep all of this kind of data. You would have thought, judging over the things we've heard over the many years, and the reaction to the Supreme Court's decision, that it was everywhere. Considering all of this, it is leading me to believe that actually affirmative action in higher education was a shiny object. A shiny object. And by that I mean the issue of affirmative action in higher education was actually much smaller than it was made out to be. Clearly important for some people, but when you look at the effects of affirmative action, a shiny object takes your eyes off the big picture. And I am submitting to you that there is a far bigger picture, and that affirmative action, right around through now, has kept our eyes off of the big picture. In part 2 of this podcast, we're going to take a look at what I believe is the big picture.